Today I'm going to read an excerpt from Stephen King, The Long Walk, writing as Richard Bachman. Chapter 8. 369, the goose drank wine. The monkey chewed tobacco, and the streetcar line. The line broke. The monkey got choked. They all went to heaven in a little rowboat. Children's rhyme. Ray Garrity cinched the concentrate belt tightly around his waist and firmly told himself he would eat absolutely nothing until 9:30 at least. He could tell it was going to be a hard resolution to keep. His stomach gnawed and growled. All around him, walkers were compulsively celebrating the end of the first 24 hours on the road. Scram grinned at Garrity through a mouthful of cheese spread and said something pleasant but untranslatable. Baker, in his vial of olives, real olives, and popping them into his mouth with machine-gun regularity. Pearson was jamming crackers mound with tuna spread into his mouth, and McVrees was slowly eating the chicken spread. His eyes were half-lidded, and he might have been in extreme pain, or at the pinnacle of pleasure, only one could tell. 2 more of them had gone down between 8:30 and 9. One of them had been the Wayne that the gas jockey had been cheering for a ways back. But they had come 99 miles with just 36 gone. Isn't that wonderful? Garrity thought, feeling the saliva spurt in his mouth as McVrees mopped the last of his chicken concentrate out of the tube and then cast the empty aside. Great. I hope they all drop dead right now. A teenager in pegged jeans raced a middle-aged housewife for McVrees' empty tube, which had stopped being something useful and had begun its new career as a souvenir. The housewife was closer, but the kid was faster, and the beat by half a length. "Thanks!" he hollered to McVrees, holding the bent and twisted tube aloft. He scampered back to his friends, still waving it. The housewife eyed him sourly. "Aren't you eating anything?" McVrees asked. "I'm making myself wait." "For what?" "9:30. McVrees eyed him thoughtfully. "The old self-discipline bit?" Garrity shrugged, ready for the backlash of sarcasm, but McVrees only went on looking at him. "You know something?" McVrees said finally. "What?" "If I had $1, just $1, mind you, I think I'd put it on you, Garrity. I think you've got a chance to win this thing." Garrity laughed self-consciously. "Putting the whammy on me?" "The what?" "The whammy! Like telling a pitcher he's got a no-hitter going." "Maybe I am," McVrees said. He put his hands out in front of him. They were shaking very slightly. McVrees frowned at them in a distracted sort of concentration. It was a half-lunatic sort of gaze. "I hope Barkovich buys out soon," he said. "Pete? What? If you had to do it all over again? If you knew you would get this far and still be walking, would you do it?" McVrees put his hands down and stared at Garrity. "Are you kidding? You must be." "No, I'm quite serious. Ray, I don't think I'd do it again if the Major put his pistol up against my Nate's. This is the next thing to suicide, except that a regular suicide is quicker." "True," Olson said. "How true?" He smiled a hollow concentration camp smile that made Garrity's belly crawl. 10 minutes later, they passed under a huge red and white banner that proclaimed 100 miles. Congratulations from the Jefferson Planetarium Chamber of Commerce. Congratulations to this year's Century Club Long Walkers. I got a place where they can put their Century Club, Coley Parker said. It's long and brown and the sun never shines there. Suddenly, the spotty stands of second growth pine and spruce that had bordered the road in scuffy patches were gone, hidden by the first real crowd they had seen. A tremendous cheer went up, and that was followed by another, and another, and yet another. It was like surf hammering on rocks. Flash bulbs popped and dazzled. State police held the deep ranks of people back, and bright orange nylon restraining ropes were strung along the soft shoulders. A policeman struggled with a streaming little boy. The boy had a dirty face and a snotty nose. He was waving a toy glider in one hand and an autograph book in the other. "Geez," Barker yelled. "Geez, look at 'em! Just look at 'em all!" Coley Parker was waving and smiling. Then it was not until Garrity closed up with him a little that he could hear him calling in his flat Midwestern accent, "Glad to see you, you goddamn bunch of fools!" A grin and a wave. "Hiya, Mother McCree, you goddamn bag! You're facing my ass. What a match! Howya! Garrity clapped his hands over his mouth and giggled hysterically. A man in the first rank, waving a sloppily lettered sign with Scram's name on it, had popped his eye. A row back, a fat woman in a ridiculous yellow sunsuit was being ground between three college students who were drinking beer. Stone ground fatty, Garrity thought, and laughed harder. "You're going to have hysterics. Oh my God, don't let it get you. Think about Gribble. And don't let it, don't." But it was happening. The laughter came roaring out of him until his stomach was knotted and cramped, and he was walking bent-legged, and somebody was hollering at him, screaming at him, over the roar of the crowd. It was McVrees. "Ray! Ray! What is it? You all right? They're funny!" He was nearly weeping with laughter now. "Pete! Pete, they're so funny! It's just, they're so funny!" A hard-faced little girl in a dirty sundress sat on the ground, pouty-mouthed and frowning. She made a horrible face as they passed. Garrity nearly collapsed with laughter and drew a warning. It was strange. In spite of all the noise, he could still hear the warnings clearly. "I could die," he thought. "I could just die laughing. Wouldn't that be a scream?" Coley was still smiling gaily and waving and cursing spectators and newsmen roundly, and that seemed funniest of all. Garrity fell to his knees and was warned yet again. He continued to laugh in short, barking spurts, which were all his labored lungs would allow. "He's gonna puke!" someone cried in an ecstasy of delight. "Watch him, Alice! He's gonna puke!" "Garrity! Garrity, for God's sake!" McVrees was yelling. He got an arm around Garrity, back, and hooked a hand into his armpit. Somehow he yanked him to his feet, and Garrity stumbled on. "Oh God!" Garrity gasped. "Oh Jesus Christ! They're killing me! I can't!" He broke into loose, trickling laughter once more. His knees buckled. McVrees ripped him to his feet once more. Gertie's collar tore. They were both warned. It's my last warning, Gertie thought dimly. Now I'm on my way to see that fabled farm. Sorry, Jen, Come on, you turkey! I can't lug you, McVrees hissed. I can't do it, Gertie gasped. My wind! It's gone! McVrees slapped him twice, quickly. Forehand on the right cheek, backhand on the left. Then he walked away quickly, not looking back. The laughter had gone out of him now, but his gut was jelly, his lungs empty and seemingly unable to refill. He staggered drunkenly along, weaving, trying to find his wind. Black spots danced in front of his eyes, and part of him understood how close to fainting he was. His own foot fetched against the other foot. He stumbled, almost fell, and somehow kept his balance. If I fall, I die. I never get up. They were watching him. The crowd was watching him. The cheers had died away to a muted, almost sexual murmur. They were waiting for him to fall down. He walked on, now concentrating only on putting one foot out in front of the other. Once, in the 8th grade, he had read a story by a man named Ray Bradbury. And this story was about the crowds that gather at the scenes of fatal accidents, about how these crowds always have the same faces, and about how they seem to know whether the wounded will live or die. I'm going to live a little longer, Garrity told them. I'm going to live. I'm going to live a little bit longer. He made his feet rise and fall to the steady cadence of his head. He blotted everything else out, even Jan. He was not aware of the head, or of Coley Parker, or of Frankie Delioeso. He was not even aware of the steady, dull pain in his feet and the frozen stiffness of the hamstring muscles behind his knees. The thought pounded in his mind like a big kettle drum, like a heartbeat. Live a little longer, live a little longer, live a little longer, until the words themselves became meaningless and signified nothing. It was the sound of the guns that brought him out of it. In the crowd-hushed stillness, the sound was shockingly loud, and he could hear someone screaming. Now you know, he thought. You live long enough to hear the sound of the guns, long enough to hear yourself screaming. But one of his feet kicked a small stone in, and there was pain, and it wasn't him that had bought it. It was 64, a pleasant, smiling boy named Frank Morgan. They were dragging Frank Morgan off the road. His glasses were dragging and bouncing on the pavement, still hooked stubbornly over one ear. The left lens had been shattered. I'm not dead, he said dazedly. Shock hit him in a warm blue wave, threatening to turn his legs to water again. Yeah, but you ought to be, McVrees said. You saved him, Olson said, turning it into a curse. Why did you do that? Why did you do it? His eyes were as shiny and as blank as doorknobs. I'd kill you if I could. I hate you. You're gonna die, McVrees. You wait and see. God's gonna strike you dead for what you did. God's gonna strike you dead as dog shit. His voice was pallid and empty. Gertie could almost smell the shroud on him. He clapped his own hands over his mouth and moaned through them. The truth was that the smell of the shroud was on all of them. Piss on you, McVrees said calmly. I pay my debts, that's all. He looked at Garrity. We're square, man. It's the end. Right? He walked away, not hurrying, and was soon only another colored shirt about 20 yards ahead. Garrity's wind came back, but very slowly, and for a long time he was sure he could feel a stitch coming in his side. But at last that faded. McFreeze had saved his life. He had gone into hysterics, had a laughing jag, and McFreeze had saved him from going down. We're square, man. It's the end, right? All right. God will punish him, Hank Olson was blaring with dead and unearthly assurance. God will strike him down. Shut up or I'll strike you down, Abram said. The day grew yet hotter and small. Quibbling arguments broke out like bushfires. The huge crowd dwindled a little as they walked out of the radius of TV cameras and microphones, but it did not disappear, even break into isolated knots of spectators. The crowd had come now, and the crowd was here to stay. The people who made it up merged into one anonymous crowd face, a vapid, eager visage that duplicated itself mile by mile. It peopled doorsteps, lawns, driveways, picnic areas, gas station tarmacs, where enterprise owners had charged admission, and in the next town they passed through, both sides of the street and the parking lot of the town supermarket. The crowd face mugged and gibbered and cheered, but always remained essentially the same. It watched ferociously as Wyman squatted to make his bowels work. Men, women, and children. The crowd face was always the same, and Garrity tired of it quickly. He wanted to thank McBreeze, but some doubted that McBreeze wanted to be thanked. They could see him up ahead, walking behind Barkovich. McVreeze was staring intently at Barkovich's neck. 9:30 came and passed. The crowd seemed to intensify the heat, and Garrity unbuttoned his shirt to just above his belt buckle. He wondered if Freaky Deliesso had known he was going to buy a ticket before he did. He supposed that knowing wouldn't have really changed things for him, one way or the other. The road inclined steeply, and the crowd fell away momentarily as they climbed up and over 4 sets of east-west railroad tracks that came below, glittering hotly in their bed of cinders. At the top, as they crossed the wooden bridge, Garrity could see another belt of woods ahead, and the built-up, almost suburban area through which they had just passed to the right and left. A cool breeze played over his sweaty skin, making him shiver. Scram squeezed sharply 3 times. "I am getting a cold," he announced disgustedly. "That'll take the starch right out of you," Pearson said. "That's a bitch." "I'll just have to work harder," Scram said. "You must be made of steel," Pearson said. "If I had a cold, I think I'd roll over and die. That's how little energy I've got left." "Roll over and die now," Barkovich yelled. "Save some energy." "Shut up and keep walking, killer," McVreeze said immediately. Barkovich looked around at him. "Why don't you get off my back, McVreeze? Go walk somewhere else. It's a free road. I'll walk right damn well please." Barkovich hawked, spat, and dismissed him. Garrity opened one of his food containers and began to eat cream cheese on crackers. His stomach growled bitterly at the first bite. Then he had to fight himself to keep from wolfing everything down. He squeezed a tube of roast beef concentrate into his mouth, swallowing steadily. He washed it down with water and then made himself stop there. They walked by a lumber yard where men stood atop stacks of planks, silhouetted against the sky like Indians, waving to them. Then they were in the woods again, and silence seemed to fall with a crash. It was not silent, of course. Walkers talked, the half-track ground along mechanically. Somebody broke wind, somebody laughed, somebody behind Garrity made a hopeless little groaning sound. The sides of the road were still lined with spectators, but the great Century Club crowd had disappeared, and it seemed quite by comparison. Birds sang in their high-crowned trees. The furtive breeze now and then masked the heat for a moment or two, sounding like a lost soul as it soft through the trees. A brown squirrel froze on a high branch, tail bushed out, black eyes brutally attentive, a nut caught between his rat-like front paws. He chittered at them, then scurried higher up and disappeared. A plane droned far away, like a giant fly. To Garrity, it seemed that everyone was deliberately giving him the silent treatment. McVrees was still walking behind Barkovich. Pearson and Baker were talking about chess. Abram was eating noisily and wiping his hands on his shirt. Scram had torn off a piece of his t-shirt and was using it as a hanky. Kelly Parker was swapping girls with Wyman, and Olson, but he didn't even want to look at Olson, who seemed to want to implicate everyone else as an accessory in his own approaching death. So he began to drop back, very carefully, just a little at a time, very mindful of his 3 warnings, until he was with Stebbins. The purple pants were dusty now. There were dark circles of sweat under the armpits of the chambray shirt. Whatever else Stebbins was, he wasn't Superman. He looked up at Garrity for a moment, lean-faced questioning, and then dropped his gaze back to the road. The knob of spine at the base of his neck was very prominent. "Now how come there ain't more people?" Garrity asked earnestly. "Watching, I mean." For a moment he didn't think Stebbins was going to answer. But finally he looked up again, brushed the hair off his forehead, and replied, "There will be. Wait a while. They'll be sitting on roofs 3 deep to look at you." But somebody said there were billions bet on this. You'd think they'd be lined up 3 deep the whole way, and that they'd be TV coverage. It's discouraged. Why? "Why ask me?" "Because you know," Garrity said, exasperated. "How do you know?" "Jesus! Just remind me of the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland sometimes," Garrity said. "Don't you ever just talk? How long would you last with people screaming at you from both sides? The body odor alone would be enough to drive you insane after a while. It would be like walking 300 miles through Times Square on New Year's Eve." "But they do let them watch, don't they? Someone said it was a big crowd from Old Town on." "I'm not the caterpillar, anyway," Stebbins said with a small, somehow secretive smile. "I'm more the white rabbit type." don't you think? Except I left my gold watch at home, and no one has invited me to tea. At least, to the best of my knowledge, no one has. Maybe that's what I'll ask for when I win. When they ask me what I want for my prize, I'll say, "Why, I want to be invited home for tea." God damn it! Stebbins smiled more widely. But it was still only an exercise in lip pulling. Now, from Old Town or thereabouts, the damper is off. By then, no one is thinking very much about mundane things, like BO, and there's continuous TV coverage from Augusta. The long walk is the national pastime, after all. And why not here? Too soon, Stephan said. Too soon. From around the next curve, the guns roared again, startling a pheasant that rose from the underbrush in an electric uprush of beating feathers. Garrity and Stebbins rounded the curve, but the body bag was already being zipped up. Fast work. He couldn't see who it had been. You reach a certain point, Stephan said, when a crowd ceases to matter. Either is an incentive or a drawback. It ceases to be there. Like a man on a scaffold, I think. You borrow away from the crowd. I think I understand that, Garrity said. He felt timid. If you understood it, you wouldn't have gone into hysterics back there and needed your friend to save your ass. But you will. How far do you borrow, I wonder? How deep are you? I don't know. Well, that's something you'll get to find out, too. Plumb the unplumbed depths of Garrity. Sounds almost like a travelette, doesn't it? You burrow until you hit bedrock. Then you burrow into the bedrock. And finally you get to the bottom. And then you buy out. That's my idea. Let's hear yours. Garrity said nothing. Right at present, he had no ideas. The walk went on. The heat went on. The sun hung suspended just above the line of trees, and the road cut its way through. Their shadows were stubby dwarfs. Around 10 o'clock, one of the soldiers disappeared through the back hatch of the half-track and reappeared with a long pole. The upper two-thirds of the pole was shrouded in cloth. He closed the hatch and dropped the end of the pole into a slot in the middle. He reached under the cloth and did something. Fiddled something. Probably a stud. A moment later, a large, dun-colored sun umbrella popped up. It shaded most of the half-track's metal surface. He and the other two soldiers currently on duty sat cross-legged at the army drab parcel shade. "You rotten son of a bitches!" somebody screamed. "My prize is going to be your public castration." The soldiers did not seem to exactly struck to the heart with terror at the thought. They continued to scan the walkers with their blank eyes, referring occasionally to their computerized counsel. They'll probably take this out on their wives, Garrity said, when it's over. Oh, I'm sure they do, Stebbins said, and laughed. Garrity didn't want to walk with Stebbins anymore. Not right now. Stebbins made him uneasy. He could only take Stebbins in small doses. He walked faster, leaving Stebbins by himself, and 10:02. In 23 minutes he could drop a warning. But for now he was still walking with 3. It didn't scare him the way he thought it would. There was still an unshakable blind assurance that his organism, Ray Garrity, could not die. The others could die. They were extras in the movie of his life. But not Ray Garrity, star of that long-running hit film, The Ray Garrity Story. Maybe he would eventually come to understand the untruth of that emotionally as well as intellectually. Maybe that was the final depth of which Stebbins had spoken. It was shivery, unwelcome thought. Without realizing it, he had walked 3/4 of the way through the pack. He was behind McVree's again, and there were 3 of them in the fatigue-ridden conger line, Barkovich at the front, still trying to look cocky, but flaking a bit around the edges. McVree's, with his head slumped, hands half clenched, favoring his left foot a little now, and bringing up the rear, the star of the Ray Garrity story himself. How do I look? He wondered. He rubbed a hand up the side of his cheek and listened to the rasp of his hand against his light bearded stubble. Probably he didn't look all that snappy himself. He stepped up his pace a little more until he was walking abreast of McVree's, who looked over briefly and then back at Barkovich. His eyes were dark and hard to read. They climbed a short step and savagely sunny rise and then crossed another small bridge. 15 minutes went by, then 20. McVrees didn't say anything. Garrity cleared his throat twice, but said nothing. He thought that the longer you went without speaking, the harder it gets to break the silence. Probably McVrees was pissed that he had saved his ass now. Probably McVrees had repented of it. It made Garrity's stomach quiver emptily. It was all hopeless and stupid and pointless. Most of all that. So goddamn pointless, it was really pitiful. He opened his mouth to tell McVrees that, but before he could, McVrees spoke. Everything's all right. Everything's all right. Barkovich jumped at the sound of his voice, and McVrees added, Not you, killer. Nothing's going to be all right for you. Just keep striding. Eat my meat, Barkovich snarled. I guess I caused you some trouble, Garrity said in a low voice. I told you, fair is fair, square is square, and quits are quits, McVree said evenly. I won't do it again. I want you to know that. I understand that, Garrity said. I just... Don't hurt me, someone screamed. Please don't hurt me! It was a redhead with a plaid shirt tied around his waist. He had stopped in the middle of the road and was weeping. He was given first warning, and then he raced toward the half-track. His tears cutting runnels through the sweaty dirt on his face, red hair glinting like a fire in the sun. Don't! I can't! Please! Oh, my mother! I can't! Don't! No more! My feet! He was trying to scale the side of one of the soldiers, and one of the soldiers brought the butt of his carbine down on his hands. The boy cried out and fell in a heap. He screamed again, a high, incredible thin note that seemed sharp enough to shatter glass. And what he was screaming was, "My feet! Jesus!" Garrity muttered. "Why doesn't he stop that?" The screams went on and on. "No doubt he can," McVrees said clinically. The back treads of the half-track ran over his legs. Garrity looked and felt his stomach lurch into his throat. It was true. No wonder the red-headed kid was screaming about his feet. They'd been obliterated. "Warning! Warning, 38! I want to go home," someone behind Garrity said quite quietly. "Oh, Christ, do I ever want to go home?" A moment later, the red-headed boy's face was blown away. "But I'm going to see my girlfriend in Freeport," Garrity said rapidly. "And I'm not going to have any warnings, and I'm going to kiss her. God, I miss her. God, Jesus, did you see his legs?" They were still warning him. Pete, like they thought he was going to get up and walk. Another boy has gone over to that Silver City, Lord Barkovich, in tune. "Shut up, killer," McVrees said absently. "She's pretty, right? Your girlfriend?" "She's beautiful. I love her." McVrees smiled. "Gonna marry her?" "Yeah," Garrity babbled. "We're gonna be Mr. and Mrs. Norman Normal. 4 kids and a collie dog. His legs didn't have any legs. They ran over him. They can't run over a guy. That isn't in the rules. Somebody ought to report that. Somebody." "2 boys and 2 girls. That what you're gonna have?" Yeah. She's beautiful. I just wish I hadn't. And the first kid will be Ray Jr., and the dog will have a dish with his name on it, right?" Garrity raised his head slowly, like a punch-drunk fighter. "Are you making fun of me, or what?" "No!" Barkovich exclaimed. "He's shitting on you, boy, and don't you forget it. But I'll dance on his grave for you. Don't worry." He cackled briefly. "Shut up, killer," McVrees said. "I'm not dumping on you, Ray. Come on, let's get away from the killer here." "Shove it up your ass," Barkovich screamed after them. "She love you? Your girl, Jan?" "Yeah, I think so," Garrity said. McVrees shook his head slowly. "All of that romantic horse shit. You know, it's true. At least, for some people, for some short time. It is. It was for me. I felt like you." He looked at Garrity. "You still want to hear about the scar?" They rounded a bend, and a camper load of children squealed and waved. "Yes," Garrity said. "Why?" He looked at Garrity, but his suddenly naked eyes might have been searching himself. "I want to help you," Garrity said. McVrees looked down at his feet. "Hurts. I can't wiggle my toes very much anymore. My neck is stiff and my kidneys ache. My girl turned out to be a bitch, Garrity. I got into this long walk shit the same way that guys used to get into the Foreign Legion." In the words of the great rock and roll poet, I gave her my heart. She tore it apart. And who gives a fart? Garrity said nothing. It was 10:30. Freeport was still far. Her name was Priscilla, McVree said. You think you got a case? I was the original corny kid. Moon June was my middle name. I used to kiss her fingers. I even took to reading Keats to her out in back of house when the wind was right. Her old man kept cows, and the smell of cow shit goes. To put it in the most delicate way, in a peculiar fashion with the works of John Keats. Maybe I should have read the Swinburne when the wind was wrong. McVree laughed. You're cheating what you felt, Garrity said. Oh, you're the one faking it, right? Not that it matters. All you remember is the great romance. Not all the times you went home and jerked your meat after whispering words of love in her shell-pink ear. You fake your way, I'll fake mine. McVree seemed not to have heard. These things don't even bear the weight of conversation, he said. J.D. Salinger, John Knowles, even James Kirkwood, and the guide Don Breeds. They've destroyed being an adolescent, Gertie. If you're a 16-year-old boy, you can't discuss the pains of adolescent love with any decency anymore. You just come off sounding like fucking Ron Howard with a heart-on. McVrees laughed a little hysterically. Garrity had no idea what McVrees was talking about. He was secure in his love for Jan. He didn't feel in the least self-conscious about it. Their feet scuffed on the road. Garrity could feel his right heel wobbling. Pretty soon the nails would let go, and he would shed the steel heel like a dead skin. Behind them, Scram had a coughing fit. It was the walk that bothered Garrity, not all this weird shit about romantic love. Well, that doesn't have anything to do with the story, McVree said. As if reading his mind. About the scar. It was last summer. We both wanted to get away from home, away from our parents, and away from the smell of that cow shit, so the great romance could bloom in earnest. So we got jobs working for a pajama factory in New Jersey. How does that grab you, Garrity? A PJ factory in New Jersey. We got separate apartments in Newark, Great Town, Newark. On a given day, you can smell all the cow shit of New Jersey in Newark. Our parents kicked a little, but with separate apartments and good summer jobs, they didn't kick too much. My place was with two other guys, and they were three girls in the press. We left on June in the 3rd in my car. And we stopped once around 3 in the afternoon at a motel and got rid of the virginity problem. I felt like a real crook. She didn't really want to screw, but she wanted to please me. That was the Shady Nook Motel. When we were done, I flushed that Trojan down the Shady Nook John and washed out my mouth with a Shady Nook paper cup. It was all very romantic, very ethereal. Then it was on to Newark, smelling the cow shit and being so sure it was different cow shit. I dropped her at her apartment and then went on to my own. The next Monday we started in the Plymouth sleepwear factory. It wasn't much like the movies, Garrity. It stank of raw cloth, and my foreman was a bastard, and during lunch break we used to throw bailing hooks at the rats under the fabric bags. But I didn't mind because it was love. See? It was love. He spat dryly into the dust, swallowed from his canteen, then yelled for another one. They were climbing a long, curved, blanked hill now, and his words came in and out of breath bursts. Puss, on the first floor, a showcase of the idiot tourist who didn't have anything better to do than to go on a guided tour of the place that made their jams. It was nice down where Pris was. Pastel walls, nice modern machinery, air conditioning. Pris sewed on buttons for 7 till 3. Just think. They're all men all over the country wearing PJs held up by Priscilla's buttons. That is a thought to warm the coldest heart. I was on the 5th floor. I was a bagger. See, down in the basement they dyed the raw cloth and sent it up to the 5th floor in these warm air tubes. They'd ring a bell when the whole lot was done. Then I'd open up my bin and there'd be a whole shitload of loose fiber, all the colors of the rainbow. I'd pitchfork it out, put it in 200-pound sacks, and chain hoist the sacks onto a big pile of other sacks for the pecker machine. They'd separate it, the weaving machines wove it, some other guys cut it and sewed it into pajamas. And down there on the pretty pastel first floor, Pris put on the buttons while the dumbass tourists watched her and the other girls through this glass wall, you see? Just like the people are watching us today. Am I getting through to you at all, Garrity? The scar, Garrity reminded. I keep wandering away from that, don't I? McVrees wiped his forehead and unbuttoned his shirt as they breasted the hill. Waves of woods stretched away from them to a horizon poked with mountains. They met the sky like interlocking jigsaw pieces, perhaps 10 miles away, almost lost in a heat haze. Fire tower jutted up through the green. The road cut through it all like a sliding gray serpent. At first, the joy and bliss was in Keithville all the way. I screwed her 3 or more times, all at the drive-in with the smell of cow shit coming in through the car window from the next pasture over. And I could never get all that loose fabric out of my hair, no matter how many times I shampooed. And the worst thing was she was getting away from me, going beyond me. I loved her, I really did. I knew it was there, was no way I could tell her any more so she'd understand. And I couldn't even screw it into her. It was always that smell of cow shit. The thing it is, Garrity, the factory was on piecework. That means we got lousy wages. But a percentage for all we did over a certain minimum. I wasn't a very good bagger. I did about 23 bags a day, but the norm was usually right around 30. This did not endear me to the rest of the boys, because I was fucking them up. Harlan down in the dye house couldn't make piecework because I was tying up his blower with full bends. Ralph on the pecker couldn't make piecework because I wasn't shifting enough bags over to it. It wasn't pleasant. I saw to it that it wasn't pleasant. You understand? Yeah, Gertie said. He wiped the back of his hand across his neck and then wiped his hand on his pants. It made a dark stain. Meanwhile, down in buttoning, Pris was keeping herself busy. Some nights she'd talk for hours about her girlfriends, and it was usually the same tune. How much this one was making, how much that one was making, and most of all, how much she was making. And she was making plenty. So I gotta find out how much fun it is to be in competition with the girl you want to marry. At the end of the week, I'd go home with a check for $64.40 and put some Cornhuskers lotion on my blisters. She was making something like 90 a week and socking it away as fast as she could run it to the bank. And when I suggested we go someplace Dutch, you would have thought I suggested ritual murder. After a while, I stopped screwing her. I'd like to say I stopped going to bed with her. It's more pleasant. But we never had a bed to go to. I couldn't take her to my apartment. There were usually about 16 guys there drinking beer, and there were always people at her place. That's what she said. Anyway, I couldn't afford another motel room, and I certainly wasn't going to suggest we go Dutch on that. So it was just screwing in the back seat at the drive-in, and I could tell she was getting disgusted. And since I knew it, and since I had started to hate her, even though I still loved her, I asked her to marry me. Right then. She started wriggling around, trying to put me off, but I made her come out with it, yes or no, and it was no. So it was no. Pete, we couldn't afford it. What would my mom say? Pete, we have to wait. Pete this and Pete that, and all the time the real person was her money. The money she was making sewing on buttons. Well, you were damned unfair to ask her. Sure, I was unfair, McCree said savagely. I knew that. I wanted to make her feel like a greedy, self-centered little bitch because she was making me feel like a failure. His hand crept up to the scar. Only she didn't have to make me feel like a failure because I was a failure. I didn't have anything in particular going for me except a cock to stick in her, and she wouldn't even make me feel like a man by refusing that. The guns roared behind them. Olson! McVrees asked. No, it's the Becker. Oh, the scar, Garrity reminded. Oh, why don't you let it alone? You saved my life. Shut on you, the scar. They got into a fight, McVree said finally, after a long pause, with Ralph, the guy on the picker. He blacked both my eyes and told me I better take off or he'd break my arm. As well, I turned in my time and told Pris that night that I'd quit. She could see what I looked like for herself. She understood. She said that was probably best. I told her I was going home and I asked her to come. She said she couldn't. I said she was nothing but a slave to her fucking buttons and that I wished I'd never seen her. That was just so much poison inside me, Garrity. I told her she was a fool and unfeeling bitch that couldn't see any further than the goddamn bank book she carried around in her purse. Nothing I said was fair, but there was some truth in all of it, I guess. Enough. We were at her apartment. That was the first time I'd ever been there when all her roommates were out. They were at the movies. I tried to take her to bed and she cut my face open with a letter opener. It was a gag letter opener. A friend of hers sent it to her from England. It had a Paddington bear on it. She cut me like I was trying to rape her. Like I was germs and I'd infect her. Am I giving you the drift, Ray? Yes, I'm getting it, Garrity said. Up ahead, a white station wagon with the words WHGH Newsmobile lettered on the side was pulled off the road. As they drew near, a balding man in a skinny suit began shooting them with a big newsreel cinecamera. Pearson, Abram, and Jensen all clutched their crotches with their left hand and thumbed their noses with their right. There was a rocket-like precision about this little act of defiance that bemused Garrity. I cried, McVeary said. I cried like a baby. I got down on my knees and held her skirt and begged her to forgive me. And all the blood was getting on the floor. It was basically a disgusting scene. Garrity. She gagged and ran off into the bathroom. She threw up. I could hear her throwing up. When she came out, she had a towel for my face. She said she never wanted to see me again. She was crying. She asked me why I'd done that to her. Hurt her like that. She said I had no right. There I was, Ray, with my face cut wide open, and she's asking me why I hurt her. Yeah? Felt like a towel. I left with the towel still on my face. I had 12 stitches, and that's the story of the fabulous scar, and aren't you happy? You ever seen her since? No, McCreary said. I have no real urge to. She seems very small to me now, very far away. Pris at some point in my life is no more than a speck on the horizon. She really was mental, Ray, something. Her mother, maybe. Her mother was a lush. Something had fixed her on the subject of money. She was a real miser. Distance lends perspective, they say. Yesterday morning, Pris was still very important to me. Now she's nothing. That story I just told you, I thought that would hurt. It didn't hurt. Besides, I doubt if all that shit really has anything to do with why I'm here. I just made a handy excuse at the time. What do you mean? Why are you here, Garrity? No. His voice was mechanical, doll-like. Freaky Dilueso hadn't been able to see the ball coming. His eyes weren't right. His depth perception was screwed. It had hit him in the forehead and branded him with stitches. And later, or earlier, all of his past was mixed up and fluid now. He had hit his best friend in the mouth with the barrel of an air rifle. Maybe he had a scar like McVrie's. Jimmy? He and Jimmy had been playing doctor. You don't know, McVrie said. You're dying and you don't know why. It's not important after you're dead. Yeah, maybe, McVrie said. There's one thing you ought to know, Ray, so it won't be so pointless. What's that? Why, that you've been had. You mean you really didn't know that, right? You really didn't? Chapter 9.